All right, Dr. Cox, take us through, maybe this is a Religion 101 class, maybe we've just graduated to like 304 level or 504 level, but we talk so much about the future of the church. From your perspective, though, I'd love to hear more about the history of the church. Take us back to when we need to know about the history of the church. Give us this 5 to 10 minute dialogue about what's important for helping us learn about our future as we look at our past.
Okay, so the history of the church is, I mean, you're asking me to, in 5 and 10 minutes, talk about only 2,000
really
years.
Easy stuff.
The history of the church is about Jesus. And I don't mean that in a closed-minded, dogmatic way. I just mean that that's what sets us apart from just about anybody or anything else is Jesus, our faith in him, our awareness of him. So that's what the history of the church is. And so everything comes back to him, right? First of all, there's a couple of different ways you can tell the story of the church. The way that Christians have often told the story is it's basically a story of one great river that flows from Jesus all the way to the present. Jesus taught the apostles then handed it off to their followers who have preserved it all the way to the present. They wrote down their teachings in the New Testament. That's been preserved to the present, so we have the one faith. That's the way that you very often hear the story. When you start talking to scholars in academic settings, what they say is it's actually more like there's this garden with this soil, the historical Jesus, and out of that soil grows these different reactions to Jesus. And that's something that we see in the Gospels. And if you look at the 4 Gospels, yeah, they're very, very similar, but they're not identical. And so even the New Testament, which is unified by its devotion to Jesus, understands that there are different ways of responding to him, different perspectives. All are held together by this. He was a great teacher, he comes from God, he dies on the cross, he rises from the dead. He is in fact the Son of God. And I believe that all 4 Gospels are clear that Jesus is the one through whom God is reconciling the world to himself and is God's Son, and in the words of John, is God in the flesh, right? John 1:14, the Word became flesh. Now, when you start to look at church history, what you have to be aware of is that variety just becomes, in some ways, more and more because the circumstances change. So you may have some reactions to Jesus that focus on Jesus as the teacher, and then other reactions that focus on his death and his resurrection and that kind of idea. And then, maybe some others that focus on Jesus as a sort of enlightened spiritual being that's bringing information about the heavenly world and sort of trying to wake us up to our true selves. So there's all these different stories floating around, all these different reactions, different communities. And even in the first century, you can see from the way that letters are written and the Gospels are written, they're talking to people who may not share their same views about Jesus. And what views did those other people have? And we know by the 2nd century, you have kind of the Wild West of Christianity. And there's a sense of what's the authoritative take, what's the right take. They have rival visions of who God is, what humanity is, how Christ saves us, and what are they trying to do? They're each trying to get their story out, each trying to say, hey, this is what is true, this is who Jesus really is, this is what he's really done. You move into the 3rd century, and now the debate is about what is the relationship between Jesus and God? So you begin to see discussions, for instance, about the Trinity. And is God the Father, God the Son, and God the Spirit all one thing? Or are they, 3 things? And there's this debate, is it monotheism? Is it tritheism? And at the same time, the church is growing. Always it's been a little speck. And always it's been, for the first couple of centuries, very small, isn't on the radar of Rome, and in some ways is competing with Rome in the way that it cares for people and the image that it gets out there. It's a very different value system. But again, theologically, they're having conversations, debates, sometimes fights about who is God and how is God saving them through Christ. But in terms of how they live their lives out, they're also embodying what they believe about Jesus. They are able to live as the one who comes from God, is not worried about themselves, but worried about other people and gives themselves to other people. They're embodying Jesus in the way that they live. You can go on and look at the 4th century, the 300s. Now you get Roman imperial involvement in church matters, and in some ways, the church becomes flush with resources. At the beginning of that century, Rome was taking away church property, taking away scrolls, which were really expensive, books, which were really expensive to have. They were killing church leaders, they were imprisoning them. Now, the emperor is paying for church buildings, paying for copies of the Bible. Church authorities are serving as basically magistrates in cities, and judges. And so you have a complete reversal. And it's a crisis for the church. What do we do? How do we remain faithful? And at this point, one of the most significant stories, I think, in Christianity begins to develop. It's the story of monasticism. And it had started earlier, but it really begins to flower in the 4th century. And it's this issue of how do we remain faithful to God when we also live in a world where Christians have power, they have influence. And so the monastics feel called away from those things in the light of Jesus. And so you see a dance going on between the church that's in the public, that's made up of just regular people, and the monastics, sort of going back and forth over the next 1,000 years, where at times the monastics will call the church from its worldliness and its materialism, and yet will sometimes pull too hard, and the church will become too austere and not connected enough with the lives around people. Sometimes the church will call monastics back. It's this dance of preserving and yet articulating the mystery of what God was doing through Christ. That's the life of faith. So the life of the church isn't one glorious parade, it's just a real life story where people are at moments heroic and at moments cowardly, at moments righteous and at moments totally unrighteous or irreverent, and sometimes all at the same time. Then you get the Protestant Reformation, and in one sense, the story breaks up, and now you have dozens and then hundreds of different churches and all of this, where you had this sense of just one church before. But then what happens is we individually really begin to own our own faith, and yet have we been good stewards of that individual faith? And that's where we are now in this sort of hyper-individualistic age, jumping up 500 years from the Reformation, where we think we're the captains of our own ship. We think that we are, it's the priesthood of all believers, but we've forgotten who we're priests to. We've forgotten who created us and who we live toward. We have this false notion that individualism means that we are alone, and we are alone responsible and alone in control of ourselves. And somehow we have to sort of tilt back without going authoritarian, without going back to times where you have people in control telling us what to do. And at the same time, we want to be in a situation where we truly yield to Christ and offer our individuality as a gift to Him, to the church, and to the world.
Let's go.